and we're here for the next in our video series on implementing the inquiry design model using inquiry in the classroom. In this video, we're going to be focused on sources. Sources in an inquiry are where the rubber meets the road. So we're going to spend a little bit of time right now talking about sources and thinking about four things. This is what we're going to accomplish, or I hope that we'll accomplish in this session. First, we're going to review the role of sources in an inquiry. We'll spend a little bit of time putting that in the context of the inquiry design model. We're going to describe the instructional uses of sources when teaching with inquiry. So the focus is going to be here on what it means and what happens when you teach with inquiry, and how those instructional uses come into play. Then third, we'll explore how the source logic of IDM impacts teaching, and we'll look at three types of what we call source logic. And the last thing we'll do is examine instructional design considerations for implementing inquiry with a focus, of course, on sources. We'll have lots of classroom examples, so let's get started. As I said, this is all in the context of the inquiry design model. IDM is an approach to developing, as you know, an approach to developing inquiry that's inspired by the C3 framework and the inquiry arc within the C3 framework. You also know that there's a design path for IDM. When you're building an inquiry, if you go through these three phases and the 10 steps arrayed across these three stages, we think you can come out with a blueprint, which is a high-level description of the elements of an inquiry lesson. So we're going to be focused on sources, and you can see in the process of designing an inquiry, you're really dealing with sources and figuring the sources out in the middle of the design path. So the first thing we want to look at is think just about, kind of in a basic sense, about the role of sources in an inquiry. First and maybe foremost, sources help kids learn. And so what we do in inquiry and in IDM is we say that sources are the source of knowledge in an inquiry. It's where kids get knowledge from. It is the content in an inquiry. That can be a shift for some teachers. For others, it's not. They're used to using sources as a vehicle to deliver information to students. Of course, traditionally, we've thought about the textbook playing that role, and we're shifting away from that with inquiry. Teachers have a lot of responsibility, as you're going to see, in thinking about the sources very carefully at their selection, their adaptation, the modifications, all the kind of things that are done with the sources to prepare them for their use in the classroom, and then to work with students as they get into that work. Ultimately, sources open the door to content for students. It's not a 1 + 1 = 2 sort of scenario. It requires a lot of work on the part of students, and it's sophisticated work. It's a sophisticated literacy that students are going to have to engage in when pulling information out of sources that they can use for the purposes of completing tasks in an inquiry. So, I like to say that sources open the door to content because it's not explicit. It's not like everything's just right there for kids to copy down. They're going to have to do some analytical work when they're using sources. It's the information in sources, though, that move an inquiry forward. So you can have all the great questions you want, and you can put together some tasks, and they might sound good, but the sources are what's going to make it happen and put it in motion. The information that's in the sources are going to enable kids to complete the task, which is going to enable them to respond to the supporting questions, which is going to enable them to make their argument in response to the compelling question, which is going to set up an extension, if there is one, into taking informed action. So if the sources aren't working, the inquiry is just not going to work. Okay, so we're going to look at lots of examples of sources and think about this question: how sources deliver on content. And I want to take you through one example. This is a photograph from an inquiry that we designed. As you can see, there's some information at the bottom of the source of the photograph, and this is how the source would appear to students. They would get either a digital or a print copy of this, and then they would sort of move on to the next step and just try to figure out what to do with this source. So what's happening here is a lot of stuff, and I just want to kind of walk you through the way that some of the content might sort of be revealed or delivered with this source. First, the photo was taken around 1900. We know that because of the caption. because of the information, the textual information that appears with this source. Underneath the title of it, it says circa 1900. In looking at the source, you can observe and make sort of a summary statement that a woman, possibly a mother of others in the picture, is working at a sewing machine while children put together pieces of a garment. You can see that the room is small. Given the furniture and wall coverings, the setting appears to be inside of a home. That's an inference. We can't know for sure unless we have other information, but I think that if you were to say something like that, you'd be able to probably bring some reasoning to bear on why you believe that to be true. And the children are all quite young. They seem to be focused on their work as well. Again, that's sort of inferential, the young part, but the fact that they appear to be focused, this is a still time photo. But anyway, this is the kind of content that you might pull out of this particular source. This source is part of a larger inquiry. Did the American dream come true for immigrants who came to America? That's the compelling question that's driving this inquiry. The inquiry has three supporting questions. The first supporting question asks, why did people move to America and what were their hopes? The second one asks, what was life like for immigrants in America? The third supporting question asks, how did immigrant groups adapt to and shape the culture of America? Now you can see over here on the right, sources that go with this inquiry include the Emma Lazarus poem about immigration, an Ellis Island video, and this is actually a contemporary video that was created to kind of help kids understand how Ellis Island worked, 4 photographs, and data about immigration. In this particular inquiry, and these sources here focus mostly on the period of immigration from Europe to the United States in the early 20th century. So this photo is one of the 4 photos that's available in the inquiry source material. And for the most part, those 4 photographs align with question 2, which is what was life like for immigrants in America? So now if you go back to this question or this photo and you put that question in play, what was life like for immigrants who came to America, then you can see how the content that pulls out might address that, and students might be able to complete the task that goes with that particular source. So sources deliver on content, and in that example you kind of see the point that they deliver on content. They also deliver on evidence, okay? And so this is going to be a very important thing to keep in mind when you implement inquiry. You have to remember that evidence is information from the source that's being used to support a claim. That's not in a blueprint. You know, it's not as if you're going to read an inquiry and it's going to be explicitly clear when you read the blueprint of an inquiry and even the description of it, that's how this works. It's something that you need to know as a teacher when you go to implement an inquiry. So kids are working with sources, they're pulling out information, they're completing tasks, they might be making a chart, or they might be writing a paragraph, or they could be constructing a list. There's a lot of different tasks that they could do. They're working with those tasks because they're gathering together information. And they're trying to come up with explanations and say things in response to supporting questions. All of the information that students are working with when they do these formative tasks in response to the supporting questions have the potential to become evidence. It's all stuff that the kids know so that when they go to write their argument and they make claims in response to the compelling question, they can use the information that they gathered from the sources as evidence. So here's an example of another inquiry. This inquiry asks the compelling question, is compromise always fair? Now I'm going to go to the end of the inquiry here to kind of explain and walk through the way that information works as evidence and information from a source works as evidence. And we're actually going to stick with this inquiry for a while. We'll actually deal with it twice in this video. But again, I'm going to the end of the inquiry, and what you see here on the slide are 3 statements, and these statements are argument stems. So you'll recall from designing inquiries, if you've done this design path, something that you do very early in the design of an inquiry is write argument stems. An argument stem is your anticipated answer, the thing that you anticipate students will say in response to the compelling question. So here's 3 possible very high-level summary responses to this compelling question. The Great Compromise was fair to all sides because it balanced the needs of states with large and small populations. The part that's in red, it balanced the needs of states with large and small population, is information. That's information that would come from a source. So later on, we're going to look and see where it would come from and what type of source it would come from. The second one, Great Compromise gave too much power to less populated states by making representation in the Senate equal regardless of population. The third one, the Great Compromise gave too much power to heavily populated states by basing representation in the House of Representatives on population. So again, two more pieces of information that would come from sources. Okay, so this is the blueprint for that inquiry. And in this blueprint, you see the sources. And there's three sources, or actually, it's one source, but three excerpts from a source. And these three excerpts go right to the information that was in those argument stems. So in supporting question 2, what was the Virginia plan? Excerpt from the notes, from notes on the debates in the Federal Constitution, or Federal Convention of 1787, Virginia plan. That's the kind of stuff that, the information in that source is the kind of stuff that kids would use in order to make their arguments, the evidence that they would use to make their arguments. You can see there are other sources in this inquiry as well, and so there would be a lot more information that students would have access to in the process of making their arguments. All right, so let's move on now to the our second part of this video. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about instructional uses of sources when teaching with inquiry. And I want to look at three things. Featured choices in an inquiry can, as many of you may already know from doing a little bit of PD on IDM, featured choices can spark curiosity, build background knowledge, and construct arguments. So I want to talk about those in terms of implementation and what the implications are for implementation when you're thinking about sources this way. And we've really already started talking about all three of these. You know, when we get a compelling question in place, we're talking about sparking curiosity. We've talked a lot about how sources deliver on content, so that's background knowledge, and about how that content, the information in that content, can be used as evidence to support an argument. But let's look a little bit more in depth. First is sparking curiosity. We want sources, and we think sources can have the purpose of engaging kids. They can do it early in the inquiry, and they should probably do it often in the inquiry. We also know that sources can help kids connect. It can focus on relevance and the things that kids care about. Here's an example. This is a video that we use in an inquiry on children's rights. Do people around the world care about children's rights? And Malala receiving her Nobel Prize, and kids look at that, and maybe they see a young child or somebody that may be close to their age, and they think, hey, well, I might be interested in that. Here's another example of an elementary inquiry. Why should I be a global citizen? And again, it's a video. It's a video of kids doing something with a lemonade stand where they're making a difference. So sources like this, they don't have to be videos. Videos tend to be sort of engaging, but they don't have to be in videos or visual. But we like for sources, when possible, to spark curiosity. A second thing that sources do, as I've said multiple times, is build background knowledge to help kids access content so they can pull out information. Sources in an inquiry contain the disciplinary knowledge, the content and concepts students need to complete tasks. Here's an example. This is a kindergarten inquiry, or all rules, good rules, and these are some rules. And what kids have done is they've brought to class a lot of different rules, and their peers, classmates, are looking at the different rules and making summary statements about the different types of rules. And these are sources. These list of rules that kids bring in become sources for their fellow students. And the third thing that sources can do is they help kids construct arguments with evidence. So as I've said a few times, of course, you know, inquiries result in arguments, but as I've said, that sources contain the information that can be used as evidence in an argument. So we're going to go back now to that great compromise inquiry. Is compromise always fair? And we'll look at it differently here, and we'll focus really on the evidence from the source and the thing that students would do. This is an example of things students might do. So if you look at the first claim statement, argument stem, the Great Compromise was fair to all sides because it balanced the needs of states with large and small populations. The source, as I mentioned, is Madison's notes. They were taken on July 5th, 1787. And there's two pieces of information that students might pull out. That information can become evidence. The first branch of the legislature Each of the states now in the Union shall be allowed one member for every 40,000 inhabitants. That in the second branch, each state shall have an equal vote. So this is Madison's writing, where he's written about um, the Virginia plan that balanced the needs of states with large and small populations. So what a student might say is small states got their way with the arrangement for the representation in the House, and large states got their way with representation in the Senate. And then you can see for the second two argument stems, which are ultimately claims, the same kind of thing plays out. Evidence from the source or information from the source being used as evidence for the students to make an explanation. So those are some examples from the classroom of how sources can spark curiosity, help build knowledge, and lead to the construction of arguments. Let's shift to our third area of focus, and we're going to explore how a source logic or source logics of the IDM can impact teaching. We talk about there being three logics or logical ways of thinking about sources in an inquiry. The first one, it all involves varying sources. So the first type of variety we want is in the type of the source. The second type of variety we want is in complexity, and the third is in perspective. So let's take a look at each one of those. With regard to source type, the goal is to have various modalities of the sources. So you want to think about the multiple modes or communicative forms that sources can take. They can be digital, visual, spatial. You can see the list there, musical, textual. There's a lot of things that aren't here. The goal is, and the idea is to vary and to try to represent the things that are recognized and understood in society. And sometimes we find ourselves, I think, engaging in some not so good habits in classrooms where we get focused on a particular type of source, particularly, I think, in history, where they tend to be text types of sources. And there's a lot of text out there, but boy, do we ever encounter sources in a lot of other ways. And it's super important for kids to have practice with that variety of source type, with the modalities that they're going to work with in their life and experience in their life. And so some scholars that work in this area of multimodalities will talk about things like the materiality of the source, the framing of the source, the design and production of the source. So these are all things to keep in mind. Okay, so the next idea is about a source. In this inquiry, there are 13 sources, and each one of these sources is just a little bit different. In fact, there's 13 sources in 5 different types. So a lot of different modalities here. Maps, which are spatial, data sets, text, illustrations, and photographs. And so you can see that this is a good example. This Was It Destiny to Move West? Inquiry of the wide variety of source type that we want to aim for in an inquiry. The next area that we want to focus on in terms of the logic is to make sure that we have complexity. So as you look across the sources, you'd like to have a logical sort of arrangement or array of complexity. And really with regard to complexity, we're talking about student comprehension, the reading, the understanding that students make from the sources. So you got to think about general comprehension skills on the part of your students, reading level, their background knowledge, and these are all opportunities for differentiation. Perspective is another area that we want to try to vary. And so another logic that you might think of in the sources is the logic of perspective, and to make sure that a lot of perspectives are available. Of course, each source has its own origin and maker, and it's important to have a variety among those types and the origins and the people who are responsible for making a source. It's important to consider the purpose and the bias of sources, and so you want to have a variety of purpose and bias where that's possible. And this really gets us into scaffolding. So we're going to have a lot more to come on scaffolding. I'm going to talk about it a little bit in this video, and then we're actually going to have a whole nother video that just focuses on scaffolding. So our last area now is to focus on instructional design considerations for implementing inquiry. There's 3 design considerations that we want to make here. The first has to do with selecting the source. Then we want to think about adaptations that we'd make to the source, and as I mentioned, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about scaffolding the source. And all of those are sort of implementation issues.
First, when it comes to selecting the source, the teacher's got to have deep knowledge of content. In order for you to be able to select good sources, you really got to know what you're looking for. So that's really important in the design process. It's also important in the implementation process when you're trying to support students in working with the sources. You can find these sources in all the sort of usual locations, archives, libraries, collections online. But we think collaboration and sharing is particularly important, and so C3 Teachers is all about sharing sources and making sure that teachers have access to a wide range of sources to work with their students and share with their students. And then we want to make sure, as I've talked a lot about already, that we have a variety in those source types. So when you're selecting them, you've got to keep in mind that variety. And then when working with students, make sure that you're making that variety known to students. The second thing to think about, design consideration to think about, is adapting sources. And this is super important when it comes to implementation. And you're only going to know some of this stuff when you go to implement, because it's going to relate directly to the ability of your students. So we talk about doing three things with sources: excerpting, modifying, and annotating. When you excerpt, you're basically removing words or taking words out of a larger source. In this example, we had the Bill of Rights, and you just pull out the first one and say, that's the only thing that we're going to look at, instead of trying to look at all of them. And you have to be strategic in doing this, and definitely know your students, the amount of time that you have, and it's really a very personal sort of implementation decision. Modifying is another thing to do, making changes in the words so that kids can read it. We won't want the vernacular of the text or something comprehension-wise to keep students from being able to understand and make meaning out of the sources they're engaging. So this is an example of a source that's been modified. And annotating, sometimes you get these visual sources like this one, the skull rack, and you want to add some text or an annotation that helps kids make sense out of it. The last thing is scaffolding. Scaffolding is super important. We're going to have a whole video series on it. This is an example of a scaffold, and scaffolding gives kids, novices who are, just learning how to do this stuff, an opportunity to be supported in their work. And so this is an example of a scaffold. Lots more inquiries online at c3teachers.org, where you can check those out, and on your hub, the Hawaiian Hub. So thanks a lot, and look forward to talking to you on the next video.